educate, inspire, and make you think. The future is now. Topics and music that affect your life from Universal Broadcasting Network. Tune in at ubnradio.com.
Welcome to the National Safe Child Show, addressing the health, safety, and welfare of all children nationwide, because it shouldn't hurt to be a child. Here is your host, Tammy Stefano.
Hi folks, welcome to the National Safe Child Show. Thank you for joining us this evening. I have been on a bit of a hiatus, and I thank you for your patience. My dad has taken ill, and sometimes we have to step away from our lives and just really address the core of why we do what we do, why I do what I do, which is, the family unit, keeping the family unit together and addressing it and keeping it safe and nurturing it. And that's what I've had to step away to do. So thank you so much for being patient with me. We have an unbelievable show tonight. We have a world-renowned expert doctor who is addressing an issue that thousands upon thousands, if not reaching into the millions, I don't have the numbers, but I would gander to believe that might be a factual amount, of parents who are deemed to have what is called Munchausen, or Munchausen by proxy, or others know it as factitious disorder. And this doctor is an expert in this area, and she is going to shed light on the facts of what this disorder or this syndrome would entail, and how the so-called professionals are getting it wrong when they label these parents with this disorder who have lost their children as a result of this mislabeling, if you will. So I don't know if we have her on the line yet. We do. Hi, Dr. Helen Hayward-Brown. Are you with us?
Yes, good evening, Tammy. How are you?
Good evening, Dr. Helen. How would you like for me to address you, and how would you like for the audience to address you?
Oh, Helen is fine.
Thank you. Thank you for your humility. That's so kind of you. Thank you so much for being on the show tonight. I know that we had some snags and we were trying to get everything together, and I thank you for your patience with my own family situation. Truly, I do.
Yes, I'm sorry about what's been happening to you.
Thank you. Thank you. We all have to face it one day. And I think part of the reason for this show is there's many parents that don't have to face this closure, this forced closure and severance of their relationships with their children based on this mislabeling called Munchausen. And many parents have lost their children based on this, and you're here to shed a light, and I'm so grateful to have you. So without further ado, please do introduce yourself to the audience.
Well, my name is Dr. Helen Hayward-Brown. I'm actually a medical anthropologist and sociologist, so I'm not a medical practitioner.
Right.
But I did my doctoral research in relation to false allegations of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And that's an allegation which is made, it's a label which is given to mothers who allegedly are harming their children in the medical context in order to get attention. And very often this label is assigned to parents where the children have an undiagnosed illness, or there's medical controversy over the particular illness the child may actually have. And in some cases there are what I call bad faith allegations, where the allegations are made in order to protect medical practitioners against medical negligence claims.
So to protect the practitioners that are giving this label?
Yes, that's correct. So in about 70% of the cases that come to me, And usually the parents who come to me are innocent because they are so outraged that they want to reach out and contact somebody.
Right.
And generally it's known that I have a fairly good credibility, so it's known that if I look at a particular case, I can usually get to the bottom of it by using biomedical scientists to review all of the medical files and whatever and get the experts that are needed to assist. But what actually happens in many of these cases, in about 70%, what happens is the mothers pick up that there's been some kind of medical error. They may or may not know, they may have picked it up or they may not know, but it's there in the files. Sometimes they've made a complaint, sometimes they've actually started legal proceedings, but as soon as that happens, very often the parent finds that this is what they're labelled in, and that discredits the mother. And it also means that if the child is removed from the family, then the family can't get a second opinion about what is actually going on with the child's health. So there are good faith allegations where doctors really do believe that there's harm happening. They may still be wrong about it, but it's done in good faith. And then there are the bad faith ones which happen to actually protect the medical practitioners or the hospital. And normally it's a hospital specialist or a hospital environment where that type of allegation occurs.
Okay. You know, I've seen many cases where Child Protective Services, the social workers, have deemed parents, even though they have no experience, these social workers whatsoever, in any field that would give them that authority to label a parent with this disorder. They do, and we, when we subpoena, when the parent subpoenas their files, all of a sudden, for the first time, they see this label, and oftentimes they don't even know what this word means, and when they go to look it up, they see this and they're shocked.
Yes, well, I think the problem is that the label carries with it this notion of moral danger and panic, and it has enormous prejudice. And as soon as anybody in the court system hears that label, then they decide that the parent is dangerous, and a magistrate, of course, is going to think, oh, well, this mother must be dangerous, and the children are removed. But certainly a social worker or a caseworker should never be making that kind of a diagnosis. It's not helpful in any way at all anyway, but they're not qualified to make that kind of diagnosis.
Absolutely.
And in many cases, in about 50% of the cases that I see, even if a medical practitioner makes the diagnosis, very often they haven't even met the mother.
Wow. So they haven't met, so where are they getting...
How can they make a diagnosis?
Right, so where are they getting the information from in order to make this diagnosis?
Well, they will simply listen to other. They'll just ring up and listen to other doctors' reports. They'll listen to the social workers. They'll use just general literature, or they'll just use file notes on the parents.
Okay.
Without actually meeting the mother. And very often, too, they don't meet the child either. So we have cases in Australia, for example, where doctors interstate will actually make diagnoses, even in really important cases like an attempted murder charge against the mother. They will do this. Okay. And I know that it happens in other countries as well. So there's a real problem in terms of how these allegations are made. And certainly social workers should never, ever be making that type of an allegation.
But they do.
In Australia, the child protection caseworkers aren't even registered, so there isn't any sort of a particular process that you can go through as a parent to even make a complaint about that happening.
Wow. Okay. So here in the U.S., the social workers, throughout almost every state that I have received cases from, or I have been privy to these cases, and having had an opportunity to view some of the paperwork, I have seen these labels. It's one of the most common labels that Child Protective Services uses, or somebody such as an evaluator who's involved in a family custody dispute. The court wants an evaluator to go in, it's become very high contentious dispute over who gets the child, and one potentially doesn't want the other to see the child or what have you, and all of a sudden Munchausen by proxy or factitious disorder comes up. The parent gets labeled. It's interesting because several times during our very short conversation thus far, you have said the mothers. Tell me about that.
The mothers?
Yeah, you've only said oftentimes the mothers. So is it, am I to understand that fathers typically don't get labeled with this disorder?
Very rarely do the fathers. So in fact it is what you might call a misogynist label. It is actually directed at women. And even the proponents of Munchausen by proxy say that about 95% of the cases are women. So it is a way of discrediting women, and it's an excellent tool to use if you want to discredit a woman, because in fact it's almost impossible to disprove it. You have to somehow prove your innocence. So once it's been said about you, it's a perfect label to discredit a mother. And in fact, what happens is the Munchausen by proxy label suggests that a mother should be passive in her interactions with the medical profession. So, for example, in Dr. Herbert Schreier's textbook, he actually states that early on they recognised that these women were not completely passive in their interactions with the medical professionals. But in relation to a custody dispute, where there's a dispute between a wife and a husband about who should get custody of the child, if a mother accuses the father of physical or sexual abuse, then the retaliation is a Munchausen by proxy allegation against the mother. Or sometimes they may use parent alienation disorder also. You may have probably be familiar with that.
Oh, yes.
Or personality disorder, a number of those. But Munchausen by proxy has a great deal of impact because it makes the mother look pathological. I've only come across one or two cases of fathers being accused over all of the years, the 20 years that I've been studying and researching this. And in those particular cases, it occurred when the father supported the mother and said, my wife does not have Munchausen by proxy. And the response to that was, well, you both have Munchausen by proxy.
Really? So that would be in a child protective services type of issue or in a hospital issue environment?
Well, it's all combined because the mother might have been accused in the hospital context. And then when it goes to court, when the husband says, no, I support my mother, I'm not going to say anything bad against her, I think she's innocent, then they say, well, you've got Munchausen by proxy also. So that discredits the father also. So it's very common in these cases in the child protection courts where a father is actually asked to choose between his wife and his children. So he's basically, he's told basically, well, if you support your wife, then you can't have the children either.
Right.
But if you tell us something about what your wife is doing, then we may consider giving custody of the children to you.
Wow. Okay.
That's when a father is supportive of his wife. And so that's what happens. They are forced to choose between their wife and the children.
Well, I see that quite often where husband and wife really are not going against each other. Sometimes they haven't even seen each other in years. There's really not a lot of contention amongst the two of them. And Child Protective Services gets involved because there was a hospital questioning that the ego, perhaps, I would venture to actually make that statement. The ego of the physician that was treating and his diagnosis was actually questioned by the mom, and he didn't like that. He didn't like it. He didn't have the time. He was on his way out, and how dare this civilian with no formal medical training question my godlike authority?
Well, I think there are a number of things that I can say to that. The first is that very often doctors who are making these types of allegations, there is a certain arrogance involved.
Yes.
Because the belief is that if I don't know what's wrong with this child, then there's nothing wrong with the child. And of course that ignores the fact that that particular doctor may not know everything. So just because he doesn't know what's wrong with a child, it doesn't mean there's nothing wrong with the child. And also it ignores the fact that medical knowledge is not finite. What we don't understand today, we may well recognise and understand in 10 years, 20 years, 100 years' time. So that's, a sense of arrogance with these medical practitioners that they have all the answers. And then, of course, you have the issue where a lot of mothers are very well educated these days and they're intelligent, they have good intellect, they can search on the internet, and they're very motivated to understand what's going on with their child. And in some cases, I know that there are very intelligent mothers who often know almost more than the medical practitioners about a particular disease or illness that a child has, particularly if it's a rare illness or something unusual.
I mean, I always think, while my daughter was growing up, if she had any illnesses, nobody could explain her symptoms better than myself. I was living them.
Exactly.
I was there every moment, every second. There was no sleeping when your child is sick, and especially if it's a sickness that rises to a level of real concern. So put aside the common cold or flu or what have you. But you're watching everything. So when you go in to the hospital or the doctor's office, you're telling them in detail, if you can articulate such, what has happened, when it's happened, how long it's happened, what resulted in whatever it is. And they look at you like, these days anyway, like you have overstepped your boundary as a mother.
Yes. Well, I think the other thing is that when you've looked after a child from birth, you have an instinctive knowledge also about what's going on with that child.
Absolutely.
So that you know and you recognise when your child's not well or when something's different. You have that instinctive knowledge. So even if you are not necessarily a well-educated woman, I mean, educated women in some ways it is easier, but even if you're not so well-educated, a mother may instinctively know and understand that there's something wrong, and this just isn't listened to because the doctors don't have that knowledge of that particular child.
That's right.
So the medical professionals actually look at statistics. They use statistics and they say this is what all children should do. They look at this whole body of the population as every child almost having to be the same and go along a particular trajectory. Whereas in fact every child is different, and it's the mother who understands that the particular child and their particular problems. And really, the doctors should be listening to the mother very closely and learning from them because you have had the time as a mother.
That's right.
To be with that child.
That's
and
right.
understand it. But one of the problems these days is that the medical practitioners just don't have enough time to spend with the mothers and the children. And they can
isn't that kind of an oxymoron? I mean, if you don't have the time...
Sorry?
If you don't have the time to spend with them, how could you give this diagnosis? Isn't this diagnosis such a rare disorder?
Well, it's very easy to give that diagnosis. If you're a medical practitioner and you're rushed for time and this parent keeps on coming back with a child or they have symptoms that they don't understand, that's very threatening to the doctor. And they want to categorize it, you see. Medical practitioners have categories of disease. But if a child comes to them that doesn't fit into one of those categories, then they have to think of some other category. And if it's an adult, then they'll start to say, well, it's a psychiatric illness, it's all in the person's head. But they can't say that about a young child. They can't say that the young child has a psychiatric illness. So the next thing is to blame the mother and say that the mother has some kind of a mental disorder or a psychiatric illness. And very often that will be Munchausen by proxy. So it's like a garbage bin diagnosis. If the doctor doesn't know what's wrong with the child, then he can say that it's Munchausen by proxy. And that gives him the category. It gives him the label so he can stop looking then.
Right.
You see, he can stop looking for what is wrong with the child.
But is this a
and
common...
then he doesn't have to question himself.
Is it actually, I mean, the real Munchausen or factitious disorder, as the DSM-5 now, I believe, refers to it as.
Yes. Yeah.
Is it actually a rare disorder, or is it as common as it is being diagnosed to be?
Well, it's certainly not as common as it's being diagnosed, not at all. And in fact, I would say that we shouldn't use the label at all. It's not useful. The label just creates prejudice. So what doctors should be doing, if they did think that a mother was harming a child in a medical context, is to look at the evidence for that and to look at all of the hard facts and not to be using this emotional label that has prejudice about it, because it means then that if you label the mother, everything else that that doctor sees, they will see it through that particular prejudicial lens, and they will start to even misinterpret what information they're getting. So it's highly prejudicial. Doctors need to just look at the facts. I think it's very, very rarely that a mother may harm a child in the medical context. It does occasionally happen,
Of course.
but it certainly doesn't happen in the way that's being put forward. In nearly all of the cases that I've come across, they've made terrible, terrible errors in these allegations, and many, many families are suffering as a result of that.
So, if you can take briefly, just explain to us what a case would look like that would be labeled properly for somebody that does have Munchausen or factitious disorder. What would that look like? A hypothetical situation, so that the folks can have
You're
something
asking,
to... Right, just
you're asking me what would actually happen if a parent was guilty
That's
of
right.
doing
Right.
something to the
Right.
child.
What would be
Yes.
some of the symptoms, so that people can be more privy to what that would look like?
Well, first of all, let me go back to the Munchausen by proxy label.
Okay.
The problem with that is that a mother is profiled.
Okay.
So a mother is she's regarded as being over-caring, overprotective, answering questions all of the time instead of letting the child answer questions, lying, fabricating. All this is part of the profile of the Munchausen by proxy. The profile is not useful. You just have to put that aside.
Okay.
Very often nurses are accused because they have the medical knowledge.
Right.
But you have to put all of that aside and just have a look at what is actually happening. So if a parent really is harming a child, it may be fairly simple, like it may be that the mother is perhaps giving the child laxatives to give the child diarrhea. Or, for example, in one case I know that a paediatrician did tell me that a mother had actually been using dishwasher dishwasher detergent that you put in the dishwashing machine to make the child sick. So occasionally this does happen, and there is absolute proof. But in many of these cases, I've been told, for example, many times, we know this mother really has done it. We know we've got all of the information. But when you look at it, in fact, you find that they are in error.
Right.
So in many cases, even when people really believe that there has been somebody doing something, it's often wrong. My view is that if in the hospital context a doctor really does believe that a mother is harming a child, then I'm fine with the idea of putting the mother under video surveillance, because then you have the evidence the mother either is doing something or isn't doing something. Although you have to be careful that the video surveillance is not misinterpreted, because if it's bad quality, then what the mother's actions can also be misinterpreted. So you have to be very careful. But really, at the end of the day, it just needs to be, well, what is this mother doing? If this mother is saying, for example, my daughter has cancer, and shaves the child's hair off to make it look as if she's having chemotherapy, and it's just not true, well, that's an example of a mother really harming the child.
Right. So that would be something that would look like something similar to what Munchausen would look like. Right? Somebody actually going to those levels.
Although I don't like the label, I think you should just describe what
what's
the
happening.
mother may be doing.
Right.
And look at it from that perspective, because otherwise, for example, there's this big push at the moment to say, Munchausen by proxy mothers, they're mummy bloggers, they go on the internet, they're always talking about the illness and doing this and doing that.
Right.
Well, that's all very well and good, except that that's also the behaviour of an innocent mother.
Right.
An innocent mother will also want to get support from other families who have children who are sick. So a lot of these behaviours that are part of the profile are also normal behaviours. So you really can't use those to establish whether or not that mother has harmed the child or not. You have to look at the evidence of what's happening to that child, and you have to make sure that you cover all of the ground and that you don't accuse a mother of harming the child when in fact the child may have a rare or unusual illness, or even simply severe allergies and sensitivities and problems like that, which are not necessarily easily recognised, but which can affect the gut, the hormone system, the adrenal system, which a lot of mainstream medical practitioners simply don't know how to deal with.
Right, they're just not familiar enough, and like you said, they don't have the time to really address these issues in such a capacity that's necessary.
That's right. Well, we tend to encourage parents to go to a medical integrative doctor who is able to spend more hours and more time with the family to try and get to the bottom of what is wrong with the child. But very often that can be expensive for families.
Right.
And
And
families
most of
don't
these
always have
families...
those kind of finances.
Right, and so many of the families just don't have the finances, especially in this day and age. They're far and few in between that really have the finances to be able to seek alternative physicians that really do have the time, and the specialists who do have the time, unfortunately. And many of them are on state, some type of a state insurance, and that is problematic in itself, because now the state can look at that, can actually monitor the amount of times that the child is seeing the doctor, can communicate with the doctor directly, even though they shouldn't. We have found out that they often do. And go ahead.
I think that's very common practice on an international basis. In Australia, we have what's called the Medicare system. So in Australia, everybody is covered by the government insurance.
Okay.
But what happens is, in these cases, then the caseworkers are allowed, they can get a warrant and they just go and access all of the Medicare records. So whenever a mother goes to the doctor and then they claim some of it back, then it's all on the record. So what in fact happens in Australia is that many mothers choose to pay up front for the entire cost of the consultation so that it won't go through that Medicare system, so it can't be tracked.
Right. You know, I hear from I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, in some cases, it's really quite bizarre, because we've had some cases where the mother is accused of doctor shopping, going to see too many doctors, which is part of the profile.
Right.
And in some cases I've had where the mother's gone to taken the child to a pathologist to have pathology tests. And as you would know, on the top of the pathology invoice, they often have about 10 or 15 names of doctors who are all part of that same practice. And in fact, that all of those doctors' names were all listed as part of all of these doctors that this mother was supposedly accessing, which was just complete nonsense.
Wow. You know, part of what we have noticed, National Safe Child, is that if a parent looks to wants a second opinion, because the opinion of the first physician, and I'm not saying that they're right, wrong, we don't know, but that parent caring about their child, that's their child, they just want to be sure. Because the diagnosis is possibly surgery, it's possibly medication that could potentially be harmful or have long-term effects, and they want a second opinion. Well, as soon as they go for that second opinion, you hit the nail on the head, Helen. They are doctor shopping, and I've never heard of such a ludicrous label to place on somebody who cares about their child enough to get a second or a third or a fourth opinion. And you know, years ago, we were encouraged to get second opinions, but now for a parent to get a second opinion has the potential of losing your child.
Yes, I think that I know it sounds quite scary, but yes, I think that is actually the case. Because if a mother is concerned about what is wrong with her child and decides she wants a second opinion, it may be, and it's not always the case, but it may be that the first doctor really is not able to get to the bottom of what's wrong with the child. But then that therefore makes that doctor defensive, and he or she wants to protect herself, so that if a mother goes to another doctor and gets the right diagnosis, that first doctor will be afraid of being accused of medical negligence or whatever. And so that's the reason that this is no longer encouraged, because the first doctor doesn't want to be seen to be getting into trouble. And so that's where that comes from. But in fact, it's very normal behaviour, and it's good behaviour for a mother to not seek second or third or fourth opinions.
For a mother or a father, I mean, for a parent, especially a parent who has a child for the first time, their first child, I mean, they want to do everything right, and they have no experience to base their decisions on. So, of course, they're going to look. And with everything, with the media coverage of doctors who have failed in malpractice and this and that, far be it for them to not want a second or a third opinion, and yet they're persecuted. I want to get into a project that you're working on, and I have one question for you that one of our audience members has asked, which is, let me read it. What can women diagnosed with this wrongfully do to prove that they don't have this disorder, that they're acting very normally? What can they do?
Well, the first thing that they can do is to find a very good lawyer or attorney who is going to argue that Munchausen syndrome by proxy, any evidence in relation to their child, should not be used. It should be inadmissible because it's so prejudicial. All right, so you need to get that label removed, and then you have to look at, well, what is actually happening with the child. So the most important thing is for a parent to try and get the expert evidence that they can to show what is happening with the child, or to at least show an alternative in terms of what's happening with that child. But the difficulty is, in many of these child protection cases, the children are removed just because there is a risk of harm, so they don't actually have to prove. The state doesn't have to prove 100% that a mother is harming a child. They just do it on probability of harm or risk of harm. So, there is that problem, and it is very difficult to prove that you are innocent. But in fact, what parents need to do is to recognise that this label has been discredited. Sir Roy Meadow, who started all of the Munchausen by proxy theories, has been widely discredited. So this notion that it's an accepted diagnosis needs to be knocked out of the park, and it should not be. The lawyers should argue that it really should not be used at all. And then someone needs to come in, like a biomedical scientist or a medical practitioner or a nurse, and go right through all of the medical files and find out what's really happening. So, for example, you may find that, in fact, a doctor may have overdosed a child in error.
Right.
Or a doctor might say that the child doesn't have diarrhea when the child does have diarrhea. Or they may say that, the child was given a medication when the child wasn't given a medication. Very often they use the separation test, and they say, oh, look, when we removed the child from the mother, the child got well. Well, that's often not the case.
Right.
And you can't just say, oh, because of when the child was removed, the child got better, because very often the medication has been changed, the treatment regime's been changed, the environment.
I've seen that.
All
I've
of
actually
those things
seen
have
that.
changed.
Yes, I've seen that happen. When I took a closer look, they did change the medication. So naturally, the child got better, but it wasn't based on who the child was with. It was based on what the child was being prescribed. And when that prescription changed, then the child's health changed. And the child could have been anywhere.
That's right, and that's very, very common. So it's really, really vital that parents get access to all of the medical files, the child protection files, through a good attorney, And then these particular issues can be discovered if necessary. Very, very important to do all of those things. But it's not easy, as you would know. It's
Right,
a difficult,
absolutely.
difficult fight, but it is possible.
Absolutely, and we need to step it up a notch, because another thing, we have whistleblowers. I have many whistleblowers that contact me, that really do, their consciences have just reached a level where they no longer want to participate or at least hold all of this information in. And so thank God for them. But what they say is many times that these parents are labeled with this Munchausen or this factitious disorder, they are told to put it in the file that remains confidential and not disclose it to the parent, because by disclosing it to the parent puts the child at a safety risk that could reach a level of death. So they never tell the parent based on this bogus, this bogus information. And so it just stays secret. The parent never knows.
Yes, that can be very often, that's the case. Sometimes, as you know, it comes out when a court case comes up.
Right.
But the other thing I've found is when the label has been discredited, very often what happens is that they profile the parent and they say the parent's being overprotective or doctor shopping or whatever, but they don't actually give the label. So the parents don't really understand or know why they're being accused of these things, and without that label, in fact, they can't research it on the internet and look up and find out, what's going on, why are they saying these things? And I call that the invisible label, and in some ways that's even more difficult for the parents to defend, because they're being profiled in exactly the same way, but the label's not being used, it's being used secretly.
Right.
And they don't know how to defend themselves.
They don't even know that they're being given the label to defend themselves against.
I'm sorry?
They don't even know that they have this label in order to build a defense for themselves.
That's right.
And
if parents in Australia do a Freedom of Information request for the files,
right,
in Australia they're actually allowed to block out any information like that they argue would be upsetting to the mother's mental health. So in fact they're actually allowed to block that out before they give the files to the parents. So the parent needs to go to an attorney to actually get all of the files. But very often if you go to an attorney to get all of the files, it doesn't necessarily mean it will be easy for that attorney to get those files. So, for example, you may apply for the medical notes from the hospital and you'll get a set of notes, but then you may apply for the child protection notes, which may have the hospital notes included, and what you may find is that, in fact, the hospital has removed particular pages out of the notes, even though they're not supposed to do that.
That's right. Have you seen anybody?
And you will find that often those are the notes that are relating to Munchausen syndrome by proxy.
Absolutely. I agree, and I know exactly what you're speaking of, and I've seen several cases where this, in fact, has happened. What resources?
The other issue is, which is very frightening, is that I'm aware of situations where a child has been removed based on relying on a so-called expert medical certificate.
Yes.
And then if you try to get that information from the hospital, you will later find out that, in fact, it never existed. It had never been written in the first place.
Absolutely. I've seen more altered documentation. And unfortunately, we're only two people. We can only look at so many cases. We can only speak with so many parents. And I would encourage parents who have friends who are nurses or medical people to assist them and go through the files, as long as they speak with their lawyers first, so that they have permission to do that. Okay.
Because, as you know, a lot of these files are sealed.
Yes.
And parents are not allowed to speak about their specific cases usually. They're gagged in that sense, because the courts, particularly in Australia and in the UK, are closed. I know many states in the United States, the cases are closed.
Yes, in dependency and children's court, they're closed. But we have a problem with that because it is a violation of the civil rights of our freedoms in which this is the foundation of this country. Freedom of speech.
Well, justice needs to be seen to be done. And I think that if justice is done behind closed doors, then you have problems with being able to see the process and seeing that the process of justice is actually being done. The argument is that it's closed because it's to protect the identity of the children and the family, so that they won't be defamed in any way.
Right.
But in fact, in the courts here in Australia, nobody's identity is protected at all. If you go to any of the children's courts in Australia, people's names are shouted out across the microphones, or the admin people just come out and shout the names of the family, and everybody and anybody knows exactly what's going on. And everybody knows in a particular small community if children have been removed from a family. One minute they're all there with the family, the next minute they're gone. So how can you keep that identity safe, really, in that kind of context when those kinds of processes are occurring? So, in fact, the child's identity is not necessarily being protected by the state. And I think it's very important that people can go into the children's court and be allowed to see what's going on. Or at the very least, I think that people should be able to apply to the court to be able to go in. And whilst in some cases in Australia that can be done, very often it is rejected. But I do know that in the UK, Sir Justice Mumby is now actually saying that he wants the courts to be opened up to scrutiny far more. So there has been a shift to more open scrutiny. And I do believe that's been the case in a few of the states in the United States as well.
Well, we had a judge here in the Children's Court, Judge Nash, who said he actually did open up the courts just to the media. But ironically, suspiciously, he retired early. And the appellate court, appellate court, I guess a minor filed an appeal and said, I don't like having my name being out there with the media, something to that effect. And I disagree with Judge Nash's decision. And so the appellate court overturned Judge Nash, who was the presiding judge over one of the largest children's courts in America. And he decided to retire early. He's now just accepted a position, from what I've heard, overseeing the children's child abuse unit, which, we're going to take a closer look at. But the bottom line is, when he did open it up, it seems to be, I don't know, that he got admonished for it, and it got reversed. And
well, I think there is a lot of fear involved in opening these courts up, because there's no familiarity with operating these cases in the full glare of public knowledge. So
Right.
It's about the fact that the people involved in these court cases, they're not familiar with it. They're not familiar with having to operate under full scrutiny. So, of course, they're afraid.
Right,
And
absolutely.
they're afraid of going back and looking at all of the errors that have been made. So very often you have, courts maybe protecting what's happened previously in court, or you find that a more senior court may protect what a lower court has done. So sometimes there is this notion of courts protecting what has happened prior to any particular case.
Right.
My view is that it would be very good to have judgments published more frequently, which are non-identified, so protecting the privacy of the family, just using the alphabet or a pseudonym for the name.
Right.
And having the judgments published.
Well,
means
that's
that
what we
they
do
are open
here.
to
We do that
scrutiny.
here. In the U.S., they do that, and they just use the initials of the first name and the last name.
It's very rare in Australia or
Really?
in the UK for that to happen. It does happen, but it's very rare.
Well, I
So I
should
think
say,
that's an important
yeah,
part
they
of the
only do
process.
that when there is an appeal. I'm sorry, let me be corrected.
Yes, right,
Right,
exactly.
right.
Yes. So the problem is in the lower courts, because you don't have the published judgments, and I mean I'm not a lawyer, but
Right.
because you don't have the published judgments, it means that you aren't able to set precedents in as easily recognised manner.
Right, absolutely.
The judges and lawyers may use certain cases as precedents, but it's rare because, so often they're not published.
Do you think, Helen, from your experience, that there is some type of collusion going on between the judges, the attorneys, the evaluators, the doctors, the hospitals, whomever, where they all kind of have gotten together, they're now comfortable, they're familiar with each other, they're affiliated with each other, they're perhaps friends, and they just pick up the phone and make a call and say, hey, I've got another case here. Send XYZ social worker down. I don't want to deal with this. This is a crazy mom.
Yeah. Well, I think that what you're looking at here is a situation where parents very often, they find themselves in court a bit by surprise. They're not prepared. They're familiar with the processes. They believe that if they tell the truth, then it will all be all right in the end. So you've got the belief of the parent and their unfamiliarity with the situation as against the judicial process and the lawyers and caseworkers and doctors involved who are very familiar with the process. And they all, as you said, they know each other, so they have a familiarity with each other.
Right.
And they all believe and support each other. So very often you will find that the magistrates will place a great deal of weight and evidence on what the child protection workers and the doctors say.
Absolutely.
And of course a doctor has enormous status, so how does a parent stand up against that?
It's almost, it's darn near impossible for these parents, and that's why we see so many parents losing their children just because they ask some questions.
Yes. Well, you see, the thing is that once you start asking questions, then you may uncover some form of medical negligence, or by asking the questions, some doctors may see that as, oh, well, you're questioning my, my competency.
Right.
And that is not liked.
Right.
So it's certainly, very often these cases become not so much about what's in the best interest of the child, but it becomes about protecting the medical career and reputation of the doctor involved.
The best interests of the physicians and their careers and their ability to continue to practice.
Yeah, well, particularly in cases where they're criminal cases, not so much in the children's court, but in criminal cases where, in fact, the evidence does become public.
Right.
The stakes are even higher in that sense. The stakes are even higher for the medical practitioners involved. So that's when things become particularly difficult, because there will be some attempts to cover up or to protect reputations because it may be made public. But of course, at the end of the day, this should be about what's in the best interest of the child. And very often the children are not heard properly themselves in these cases.
Absolutely. And often they're not heard at all, not even properly.
No, that's
right. They're really silenced.
And very often an independent children's lawyer is appointed. I think you might call them a guardian ad litem or
minors counsel. Yeah, in California they're called minors counsel. I have very little, forgive me. I know that there are good minors counsels. I've met a few, and I know that there are some great gals, guardian ad litems. However, I have met more foul, ignorant, and corrupt guardian ad litems and minors counsels than I have met good ones, with all due respect. And I say this because
I think generally what happens is that the independent children's lawyers believe without question what the child protection and the doctors are saying. So rather than undertaking an independent investigation of their own, and rather than actually interviewing the child for a long extended period of time, they're really basically following on the path of just what the child protection workers and the doctors have said.
Well, here in California in particular, and in several states, that in itself, even that statement, Helen, respectfully, is against the law for them to do. As a practicing attorney, if they fail to interview and speak with their client, they are not representing their client. Their license to practice law should be in jeopardy. It should be questioned and it should be brought to the Bar Association. However, they are protected because these parents that go in, like we spoke about earlier, don't have the money, don't have the knowledge, and don't know that they can file these complaints. They can call these people out.
Well, I'm surprised, in fact. In Australia, an independent children's lawyer will meet with the child. It's a matter of how long and how extensive that meeting is. Certainly in Australia, it would not be allowed for a independent children's lawyer not to even meet the child.
Right. Well, here it's not allowed either, but does it happen? Yes, all the time. Here it's not allowed either. They have, I think 10 days before the hearing, they must meet with it from the time that they're appointed to 10 days prior to the hearing. They have to meet with the child. They have to hear the child's wishes based on the child's age and competency in order to be able to determine if they can make a decision, as to the parent that they want to live with or as to any situation, if they're old enough to be able to articulate. And they have to put that in their report that has to be submitted 10 days prior to the court hearing. The problem is they don't meet with the child. I see it time and time again. And unfortunately, by the time that I see the case is a year old. I'm looking at when the Minors Counsel or the guardian ad litem was appointed. It was a year prior. No, they never met with the child. I mean, there's a Minors Counsel here with a case that I'm involved in who hasn't met with her clients, that being the minors, because that's how they're getting paid, for 2 years. And yet she's gone to court several times saying what she believes to be the best. She's never met with her clients. That is a direct violation of her ability or any attorney's ability to practice law. If you don't meet with your client, you cannot.
Shocked.
Yeah, that's it.
I mean, I'm not easily shocked, but I'm shocked to hear that because in all of the cases where I've been involved in terms of Australian cases, I'm involved with cases all over the world, but in terms of the Australian cases, in each of those cases, the independent children's lawyer has generally has met.
I could give you a dozen cases that I am privy to that I have in my office's possession where the Minors Counsel or guardian ad litem has to date never met with their clients, yet they have submitted very extensive, detailed, specific wishes of their clients, having never met them, and recommendations of such, and submitted this to the courts. It's pathetic.
Yeah, the problem is that for often, as you would find out, the parents before they get help from the right places, they've gone so far down the track. It's very, very hard to rectify what has happened before.
Which leads me to my question for you: what resources can we point attorneys to, showing that this Munchausen label has been widely discredited? How can they defend? Because, far be it for us to think that all attorneys know about this in detail. They don't. Until you're down that rabbit hole, and it's unfortunate, but fortunate for us that we've, certainly you're an expert, but myself, just having touched on it and seeing the cases, where can I point attorneys that contact me to go to? Do you have a website?
Well, really, my work is on the website there to be seen.
Okay.
The attorneys, I generally don't work. I have worked as an expert witness. I prefer not to.
Okay.
I prefer to actually work as a consultant with lawyers.
Excellent.
Yes, because if I work as a consultant, it means I can look at all of the information and data, and I can still liaise with a family if I need to. Whereas if I'm taking the role of an expert witness, then I have to stop contact with the family. I have to isolate myself because my first duty is to the court and to be independent. So it's really better for me to be a consultant, because I can also look at all of the documents and I can see how a profile is forming against a parent. So it's very important for attorneys to have access to somebody like me who can pick up the clues in the paperwork, and the earlier the better in the actual process. The other thing is to get a biomedical scientist, as I said, to also go through all the medical documentation to find out, exactly what is going on from that perspective. And the other perspective is to have a look at prior cases, case law and precedents. And very often I will supply some lawyers with those precedents, particularly if it's in Australia or wherever, to have a look at the arguments that have been used previously to be able to dismiss the notion of Munchausen by proxy, or the notion of factitious disorder, or sometimes it's now just called medical child abuse.
Absolutely.
They changed the name to make it sound more scientific, because it's actually not a scientific kind of a diagnosis, but they change the name regularly to try and make it sound more legitimate. But you need to go behind that and beyond that. You need to seek out particular practitioners who have actually questioned the diagnosis, people like Dr. Eric Mart, who is a
I'm sorry, spell his last name if you would, Dr. Eric. What was the last name?
Dr. Eric Mart, M for Mary, A-R-T for Tom, is a psychologist who has questioned and queried the manner in which the Munchausen by proxy label is being used in court.
Thank you.
You have another practitioner by the name of Pankratz, P-A-N-K-R-A-T-Z, Pankratz.
Okay.
She's that person's on the West Coast.
Okay.
And they have raised questions particularly about issues to do with the separation test. So there are people out there who can be accessed to show that this is not a valid diagnosis, that it's more likely to be prejudicial than to help a court find out whether or not a mother is harming a child or not. So it's really a matter of incredibly hard work and intensive study and research. Parents have to be willing to do a lot of the research themselves, because often their attorneys can't do that for them. So they need to get a team of people, if they can, with the lawyer's permission, to go through everything and work through everything and to do a lot of the work themselves in terms of finding out exactly what's happening, getting the documentation, getting witnesses. Because part of the problem is in a lot of the courts is to do with the rules of evidence. And as you know, very often in children and family courts, hearsay evidence can be used rather than rules of evidence. And that's where a lot of that's where parents fall into traps. So, if possible, lawyers need to try and argue that evidence should be used, that the hearsay should be knocked out. There are instances, it depends on each state and what their particular legislation is, where, in some circumstances it can be argued that the rules of evidence must be used. And you could argue that because of complexity of medical issues that should be the case, rather than just going on hearsay.
Right.
And as you know, hearsay leads to so many misinterpretations.
Of course it does. And unfortunately, hearsay becomes what is considered factual, even though
that's right.
And
once it's on the record, it's regarded as fact. The other thing I would strongly recommend to parents, if there's a lot of medical data involved in their case, is to go right back to the original source of the material. Don't accept that a doctor who has written a letter or a summary of some report or some test, don't accept that on face value. If you go back to the files and go back and then go beyond that and ask for the original test results, very often you will find that they're different to what the doctors are actually saying in their summary.
Absolutely. So here I always, I'm a stickler on FOIAs as well, just to ask for your documents. You have a right to. Unless a parent has lost their parental rights, my understanding...
Well, that's right.
Yeah. they have a right to look at their child's files, period.
And if they've lost guardianship to the state, then they lose that right, as you would understand.
Well, no, here they don't lose the
attorney.
right. No, here they don't lose the right unless they've lost their parental rights have been severed.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Where there's no chance for them to parent their child any further. The children will be adopted out or has been. Even if the state detains their child, places them in foster care, there are still rights that parents have, and they don't understand that. But there are still rights because their parental rights have not been severed.
Well, I don't know exactly what the situation is in each state there, but certainly in Australia, parents still maintain the rights to be given updated information about their child's health and their school and whatever. But very often we find that that's not actually forthcoming. And certainly it's often not forthcoming because often the child remains sick or actually gets sicker away from the care of the parent who knows and understands what is wrong with the child. So very often that's the reason that information won't be given back to them.
Right.
But it's up to the lawyer to push and push and push for as much information as possible when the parent isn't able to get access to it. But I just cannot underline enough how important it is that you go back to the original source of the documents, original scans, original blood tests, all of that. It's very, very important for a parent to get access to all of that information.
Absolutely. And, we had a parent that was on the show, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, Miss Amy. And she, I'll tell you, she was accused of some things that were just so ludicrous. And when she began to look, they made this poor mom go for these drug tests, and then they said that she had positive results from the drug tests. And when she was adamant about getting these tests, lo and behold, the test results were not even hers. They accidentally, and I put quotes on that if I could, they had her name and another social security number. So folks, whoever hears this show, I highly recommend that you be so proactive in seeing, like Dr. Helen is saying, looking at your documents, and don't ask for them in such a combative way, because that just fuels the fire. That old saying, kill them with kindness. Kill them with kindness. Be professional. Ask for something and say, well, gee, I need to know why you wouldn't give it. Put everything in writing. Don't call. Put it in writing. Make yourself a record. I want to touch base, Dr. Helen, on this fabulous and very exciting documentary that you're doing, Witch Hunt. What a perfect name. Tell us about this.
That's the working title at the moment, so we don't know if we'll keep that title or not, but it's certainly our working title at the moment.
Well, it's certainly something to get the blood going, and it's excited me, the witch hunt. It's nothing less. I come from the East Coast, and in Salem, Massachusetts, that's exactly what it was. They performed witch hunts, and they slaughtered people based on... Go ahead.
Well, it's interesting that the profile of Munchausen by proxy, if you look at the profile of a witch, if you go right back to the records that have been shown in terms of what the profile of a witch was in the medieval times, in fact, the profile is exactly identical to the profile of a Munchausen by proxy mother.
Oh, my gosh.
And, of course, this is, highly embarrassing to the medical profession because generally the medical profession likes to regard themselves as being very scientific and rational and based on facts. But if you look at it, every single notion of the profile of Munchausen by proxy is the exact replica of the witchcraft allegations in medieval times. So that shows that very often these cases are not based on a rational notion at all, that it's all an emotive reason, and it's related to very often keeping women quiet and not asking questions.
Absolutely.
So our documentary is actually looking at the experiences of a number of mothers. We have to be careful about not identifying these mothers because of legal issues, but we've also interviewed a number of professionals who are speaking out about their concerns about the allegation, and we're really basically giving a voice to women whose voices have been silenced. And we're using my experience over the many, many years of understanding the pattern of what happens in these cases. We haven't spoken yet about the fact that very often if parents are not seen to be cooperative with child protection, then they may be punished in some ways in terms of how much access they get to their children.
Absolutely. Or punished, how much access. I have some moms who are completely severed just because. I mean, we've got a doctor, for goodness sakes, who I know they haven't come out publicly. I mean, this is such a textbook, exactly what we're speaking about. They haven't come out publicly and said and deemed her with Munchausen, but the bottom line is, I know that they've labeled her. We have a caller coming in. Let me see if we can take one caller. Hi, caller, are you on with us? Hello?
Hello?
Hi, yes, caller.
Yes.
Hi.
I'm just tuning in, trying to get a station. My daughter sent me a message saying, listen to so-and-so, and I don't know. It's about Munchausen by proxy.
It is. This is the National Safe Child Show, and you are live right now. Dr. Helen Hayward-Brown, a world-renowned expert, somebody who is passionate about this issue and knows her stuff, is on right now. So if you have a question, and caller, could I have your name, please? Your first name, if you'd like.
It's Cam, K-A-M.
Cam, pleasure. Thank you for calling in. Do you have a question for the doctor?
No, I don't right now, but I would love to listen in.
Oh, that's fabulous. Thank you.
Well, thank you for listening.
Well, yes. Were you deemed to have Munchausen at any point? Did you have an open case?
We have an open case. My daughter had to go to court on that over gluten intolerance.
Oh my gosh.
Her child has gluten intolerance, and her husband didn't want to not feed him. I mean, he wanted to feed him gluten, so they were trying to get gluten, Munchausen by proxy.
And
for a distorted belief that her son has gluten intolerance, which he does. He has all the blood work and the tests. So I'm just interested in listening to the program.
Oh, I'm so sorry,
Well, this
Kim.
is very common, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure
Yes.
Tammy would be aware of that too. It's very common when a child has allergies and sensitivities that are even proven that an ex-partner or another doctor may come along and say that, the mother's exaggerating or, she's being overprotective and controlling the diet too much. And it's very easy to make these types of allegations. But it does sound to me that, if all the blood work is there to show that the child does actually have these problems, then really it's a matter of organising that very carefully with the attorneys to show that it's completely in error.
They even have, the mother has celiac disease, and the grandmother has celiac disease, and their doctor is Dr. Peter Green in New York City. He testified, and we have, Brock's doctors testified that he has gluten intolerance, and he probably has celiac disease. But it's just it's a big ring of lawyers and judges and
Hospitals?
psychologists.
Are there hospitals involved or other physicians?
No hospitalization.
Okay.
No doctor.
Well, what your attorney needs to be doing is to, first of all, try and get rid of the Munchausen by proxy label, because, as I said earlier, that will be prejudicial against, the mother in any case like this. So you have to get rid of that label.
That's
so that you're just looking at the facts. And then the facts are, and if their blood work is there, as you've said, the facts are that the child does have a gluten intolerance. Then that cannot
the facts
be ignored.
are all there, and the neurologist, all the doctors have said. Who am I speaking with?
I'm sorry?
Is that Dr. Brown?
It is, yes. Yes.
It is?
Yes.
Hayward-Brown?
Yes.
Dr.
Okay, we both
Hayward-Brown is my name. So I'm not a medical practitioner. I'm a medical anthropologist.
I know.
Yes.
Right. We've studied about you and read about you, and my daughter has, and this has been going on, and they didn't actually end up finding gluten intolerance. I mean, no, Munchausen by proxy. I didn't realize I could talk to you. My daughter's been wanting to speak with you.
So did they find gluten intolerance, or did they? I'm sorry, I just got very confused.
Yes,
I know
it
it is.
too.
Yeah.
Okay. DCF came to her door and said she has been charged with Munchausen by proxy for taking her child. My daughter doesn't want me to talk to you about it right now.
Okay.
She was trying to listen too.
Okay.
But
but the bottom line is, yes, this is Dr. Hayward-Brown, Dr. Helen. She's not a medical doctor. She's an anthropologist.
I know.
Right. And
I know
obviously
all about
you're
her.
familiar with her, and her work is fabulous. And
now, how do we get in touch with her?
Well,
with you?
okay.
I know
Look,
you're on the other line.
so that's
I'm quite happy for you to make contact with me via email.
That's right.
If you Google me, my website will come up, and the email address should be there.
Okay.
And if you have any further problems, I'm sure that Tammy wouldn't mind if you contact
absolutely.
Right. We've been wanting to mail things to you, and we have all kinds of documents and
Okay, so
everything.
Cam, if you are on our chat room right now, we're speaking about Dr. Hayward-Brown, Dr. Helen's documentary right now. And in a moment or two, because we're going to be closing the show soon, we are going to post her website and a way that anybody would be able to contact her through the website or through another means, and we'll post that on the chat room. So if you are listening, you'll be able to see that. And if not, you always can contact help@nationalsafechild.com. Dr. Helen is a very trusted resource, folks, for anybody who's listening. She's very passionate. She's not a player in this. She's not plugged into the players. She's very independent. She's very true to her belief and her studies. She has extensive experience, and she's very transparent, and she believes in what she has studied. Contact her. We trust her. We've heard enough.
It's very important that we protect our families and our children,
Absolutely.
and particularly children who are suffering from very real illnesses. And as that last caller explained, very often there is debate in amongst medical professionals about whether particular illnesses exist or what tests are valid in order to show that a particular illness exists. And what happens is that the children and families become pawns in these medical debates.
Absolutely.
And, it shouldn't be happening at all, and our main interest should be for the best interest of the child, and in particular for the mothers to be respected and heard and listened to, as well as the children.
And
Very
for the
important.
mother and child bond, that is so important for the lifespan.
My grandfather was actually a very well-respected paediatrician. He was actually president of the large children's hospital here in Sydney.
Wow,
so he
fabulous.
was a very prestigious doctor, and he always used to say, ignore the mother at your peril.
Wow.
As a doctor.
My
Ignore the mother
gosh.
at your peril. In other words, you should
Yes.
listen to the mother. And this is something else that I also do, and that is that I sit down and I take the time and I listen to what parents are saying. And that way we can track down and work out exactly, what's going wrong with the use of other experts.
Absolutely.
Medical experts who can understand.
Okay, give us your website. I want to post it right now.
Well, I think it's just best for people to Google it. If they just
Absolutely.
Google my name,
Okay.
it'll come up. The website will come up, yeah.
Okay.
Because it's a bit of a tricky
Yes.
address to give orally, and people often get it wrong.
Yes.
So It's probably best if they just Google me and it'll come up straight away.
Yes.
As long as they Google my surname spelled correctly. It's Hayward -Brown.
Yeah.
And they can get my email address probably because
On
it's
that,
also a bit
I think it's
complicated.
better if they just contact you through that source.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
But look, I can't offer magic solutions to any of this.
There's no magic solution. If there were, we wouldn't be here. And the person who had the solution would be a multi-billionaire because
that's right. But families and parents should have hope, and the more information and knowledge that you have, the more chance you have of being able to get your family reunited and to also stop any if some poor parents are suffering from criminal charges as well, to be able to protect against those. In some ways, the criminal cases are easier because they have to abide by the rules of evidence.
That's absolutely right.
It's much more difficult.
And we have to start holding them accountable, and we can do that by bringing in professionals that actually know in detail specifically about this so-called disorder, or a disorder that really is almost non-existent.
That's right. And really, as we said prior, it's the prejudice of the label which is the problem. But there are some judicial officers who are beginning to understand this, fortunately.
Yes.
And so it is shifting in particular places, but we do find there seem to be hot spots, and I imagine you would find this also, so that these allegations collect very often around particular practitioners or around particular states. And it's particularly that's been the case in the UK, it's been the case in Australia, and I know that there are hot spots in the United States as well. So that happens because a particular doctor might get a bee in his bonnet or her bonnet about Munchausen by proxy, and then you find that a lot of cases collect around those practitioners.
That's absolutely right. I'll tell you, Dr. Helen, it's been, you were so patient, and it's been such a struggle to bring this together during the time when familial struggles are going on.
Yes.
But this has been so informative. I'm so very grateful to you for your work, for your time, for taking this time right now, for taking the time.
And thank you for your interest, Tammy, and thank you for your commitment to helping the families.
It's so important. We have to do this. For me, I wouldn't be able to, I don't sleep well anyway, but I really wouldn't sleep well if I wasn't doing something. It's almost like the movie The Matrix, I always say, after and you're offered the blue pill or the red pill, you almost have to say, I'll take the red pill because I need to know. I need to know what's going on, and I'm guilty of taking that red pill, and once you take it, there's no turning back. Your eyes are open, and you see a world within a world that you didn't know existed right before your very eyes, in your community, in your neighborhood, with friends.
I think a lot of parents grieve for the fact that they lose their worldview, that their worldview changes when this happens to them, that they look at the world in a different way.
And they should. I have to tell you, they should, because the world, in fact, was not the fairy tale that they had perceived before the Axemen came in and axed, put the axe in between, severed the relationship between them and their children until they got their child back or their children back or not.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult sometimes, though, because in the wider community there is a sense of denial that this is happening or that the processes aren't perfect. There's this notion of, where there's smoke, there must be fire. So, if parents find themselves in the child protection court, well, then they must have done something.
Absolutely. So that's across the board. And you know what? That perception is so terribly flawed. It needs to be changed. I mean, I have celebrities, I have doctors. Excuse me. I had we have a Harvard graduate, double credentialed, who has been deemed with this bogus label.
Yeah.
While she's treating people and saving lives, she's been deemed with this and has been severed from her relationship with her children. I have a nurse who went through 3 years of supervised visits, and her only reason was she was a nurse, and the father in this case saw these pimple-like marks that he deemed to be injection sites, and he went after her, and the department followed him. Why? Because he had an attorney that was corrupt, and I'll say it, yes, you're corrupt, who actually assaulted me in the courthouse because he was so angry because we won the case and got the child back. These are bad people. They're bad people. They know what's going on. I know for a fact that there are some that just don't know, that believe their colleagues,
That's right.
that trust their
there's
colleagues.
a difference between a good faith and a bad
Yes,
faith allegation.
absolutely. And I know that there's good and bad faith. I know that there are. I've spoken with people who have that are good faith followers. Okay, they're not looking to do the bad thing. They believe that they're doing the right thing. They just don't know. They're trusting people that they've known for years.
That's right.
You know, and so, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy and compassion for those people. And I'm always open-minded to say, listen, I'm not a young spring chicken. I didn't always know this. And my eyes are pretty open. And, it can happen to anybody. I have parents that...
I think that's the important thing, and that's the reason that we're making the documentary, because in some ways it's an educational tool, but it's also hopefully, to get the situation changed and to have social change. But in fact, that's the issue. This can happen to anybody or any family at any time.
Any socioeconomic targeted audience. What is
In fact, women of higher education are great targets because they generally are very well informed and ask all the questions that often medical practitioners don't want to hear.
Beautiful.
And they also can, research and understand what's going on with their child. And people who may not be quite as well educated are also at risk because I find very often they can be too trusting of professionals. They have a lot of reverence and respect for professionals, so they don't really anticipate that they may be accused of doing something that they haven't done.
Right.
So they have to learn not to be so trusting, and they have to learn on a steep learning curve about what's actually going on with them. But very often those mothers are very good mothers as well because they may not have the education, but they're acting instinctively with their knowledge of their child.
Of course. It's horrific.
And
Go ahead.
There are mothers across, right across the spectrum who will be accused. But very often I have found, and I think this is important for mothers who have been accused, very often I've found that it's the best mothers who actually get accused. So,
Absolutely.
for example, I had one case where a mother's child had trisomy, and the child really shouldn't have lived at all, and they didn't even look to see that the child had trisomy. They didn't even look at the blood test because they believed the mother had Munchausen by proxy. In fact, the mother was a brilliant mother and had been feeding the child with an eyedropper and kept this child alive with a particular variant of trisomy, which in fact the child, it was unbelievable. It was unheard of that the child could have lived so long, and that's why they didn't even look at the blood test.
Do you think that children are...
really good mother. She was an excellent mother.
Gosh. Do you think that children are dying potentially? Do you think that there are cases
I know that they are and that they do. I know that they are and that they do.
Because
I have a woman in Tasmania in Australia who is currently dying because she can't get any medical care at all. Her children have been removed and she cannot get any medical care for her really very real medical problems. She has been denied access to medical care in Tasmania. She has to fly to another state to get the medical care that she needs. So
how about the children? Once a
Sorry?
child gets deemed, once a parent gets deemed to be to have Munchausen, then the child's illnesses or psychosomatic illnesses are all based on the parent being, having this symptom, these symptoms, this disorder, this syndrome, whatever it is. Do you find that the physicians in many instances or some instances stop looking and they miss really important, necessary...
Yes, most definitely. It's much easier to say that the mother has Munchausen by proxy, or that the mother also has Munchausen's herself, than it is to keep on looking and searching, which may be more difficult. Very often we find that these children and parents all suffer from genetic illnesses. So, ironically, there's the argument put forward that Munchausen by proxy runs in families. So if a mother has Munchausen, her children, she will have Munchausen by proxy. Her children will grow up to be Munchausen by proxy mothers or fathers.
Is that ridiculous? Is that a ridiculous theory? Is it hereditary?
Well, it's bizarre because usually these families have a genetic illness.
Right.
That runs in the family.
Right.
But then the argument is put forward, it's quite possible to have a real illness which coexists with Munchausen by proxy. But that is a way to cover up for the mistakes and errors. If they finally do discover a child has a real illness and they can't deny it, then the argument is, then that must be coexisting with the Munchausen by proxy.
Right.
So those are the kinds of arguments that are made.
It's so ludicrous. We are in such a state. I would like to deem this a state of emergency worldwide because that's what I feel. I feel that parents are in a state of emergency with this diagnosis that is bogus. It's ridiculous. And does it exist with some people? I'm sure it does. Is it rare? Yes. I mean, I sit on a committee with IVAT. It is rare. It doesn't happen often. Does it exist? Go ahead.
I think one of the really important things about this is, people often say to me, well, how can you believe the mothers? How do you know whether to believe them or not? But it isn't a matter of belief, as I said to you previously. It's a matter of looking at the facts evidence and the process.
Right. That's right.
And as you would be familiar, it's very easy to work out at the end of the day whether a mother has done something or not, because usually the facts are there and can be found. And it's a matter of looking at that and being forensic in your investigation. So it's not a matter of belief, is it?
No, it is not. And it doesn't need to be. The facts are the facts are the facts. And if everything was weighed in properly, not the charismatic attorney that comes in that knows the court, that has a foothold in there, and that knows how to speak quite eloquently, going up against somebody who's wet behind the ears that the parent can afford, that just came out of law school, that really doesn't know the court, doesn't know the players, and is just doing his or her best. Just the facts. If we could go back to the facts.
It's difficult to sometimes, make a lot of the time that a strategy is very important in these cases. So in some cases where you have small communities where everyone is terribly familiar, it's sometimes a good idea to bring in lawyers, which we can do in Australia. We can bring in lawyers from another state, but it's different in the United States because I believe that your lawyers, are only licensed to practice in particular states, whereas in Australia, the attorneys can practice in any state. So if it's a small community or a small state, then they bring in lawyers from interstate so that they can bring in a fresh new idea and fresh approach and won't be swayed by that familiarity.
That's right. That's right. It's such a problem.
Very often in Australia too, it's difficult to get medical practitioners to go up against the medical testimony.
They're not going to. Listen, I always tell parents. I always tell parents. Their case could sound horrific, and in many instances, I mean, I get some of the most horrific cases. Okay, horrific. I mean, it's hard to believe that these cases are existent in an industrialized, civilized nation such as the U.S. or so they claim to be. However,
It's a matter of finding the right medical professionals for the right child. It's a matter of matching up the right medical professional with the right child who has the courage to speak up and say exactly what is going on with the child, and who is willing to go to court, and who also works quite well in that court environment.
That's right, because you have to know how to work in the court environment as well. It's not just having the knowledge.
That's right.
Dr. Helen, is there any published documents that you've done? I mean, I've read several of your published writings that are just fabulous. I honor you. I honor you for your work. I really, really do. Anything that you might suggest right now to the listeners, because we still have so many that are listening, and we've exceeded our time. We've got to cut it. We've got to end the show because UBN Radio, Universal Broadcasting Network Radio, has a very, very deep-rooted passion for this, and so they allow this show to go on periodically, especially if it's something that really can offer help to people. And so obviously this is one of the shows.
Well, what I would suggest is if people can access my doctoral work, and there are case studies in my doctorate. Some of it's very theoretical, but there are particular chapters that may be useful for parents to have a look at that.
Excellent.
And I would recommend that people access the work of Dr. Eric Mart, M-A-R-T. He has published text on some of the issues to do with Munchausen by proxy.
Absolutely.
There's also an excellent book. It is older now, but there is a textbook by Allison and Roberts, and where they're questioning the Munchausen by proxy allegation. It's an older book, but it goes into a lot of detail about the legal matters and the legal issues and how they can be defended. So that's an excellent textbook too. But in fact, what parents need to do is to have an attorney who's willing to listen, who's willing to do the research.
Yes.
and be forensic in their approach.
Excellent. Okay. Your documentary, do you need more people? Do you need more professionals, more doctors? Anything that you need that you want to voice?
Well, at the moment, we're almost at the stage of finishing the interviews now.
Okay.
So,
you're pretty much...
We're actually in the post-production.
Excellent.
Yes. So,
excellent.
Yes. So,
we are so excited, and you're going to let us know what the actual name is, whether you keep it Witch Hunt or whether it's whatever you decide. Yes. So
I'll be interested to know what people's opinions are about that.
Absolutely, and we'd be happy to put something out there to get some different opinions or suggestions.
Yes.
We'd be happy.
Suggestions for a name.
Absolutely, that's always, collaborative effort is always helpful. We are certainly not done with collaborating and communicating with you. We are so grateful to you. So grateful.
That's all right.
To
And
you.
if anyone has further questions, they can always email me privately.
Absolutely. Do you want me to give Do you want me to give you a private email through me or?
No, that's fine. Fine.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. That's wonderful.
All right. Well, thank you, Tammy, and I do wish you all the best with your father. I know it's a difficult time for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you
thank
so
you,
much.
Tammy. All right.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Dr. Helen. You
Thank
have
you.
a great
Bye-bye.
evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, UBN Radio. Thank you, Dr. Helen Hayward-Brown, for being on, an expert in Munchausen by proxy. UBN Radio once again has shown its concern and its passion for the issue of child safety and protecting the family unit and making sure that things are going right here in America and beyond. And folks, from the National Safe Child Show, I thank you personally for joining us, for calling us, for emailing us. If you have questions about Dr. Helen, please email us at help@HELP at nationalsafechild.com. Help@nationalsafechild.com. UBN Radio, thank you. Tony Sweet, John, my fabulous, I'm looking at him right now. Boy, oh boy, he's been donating his time for years, folks, for years, because he's that passionate about this. Thanks you, folks. I'll see you next Sunday, 7 o'clock p.m., National Safe Child Show, UBN Radio, Channel 2, 7 p.m. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the National Safe Child Show on UBN Radio. For past episodes, visit the archives on ubnradio.com. And for more information, go to nationalsafechildcoalition.com. The views and opinions expressed in these radio programs are those of the individual hosts and do not reflect the official policy or position of Universal Broadcasting Network.
Shows that make you laugh. Shows that make you think. Music that moves you. It could only be one place. Universal Broadcasting Network. Tune in at